Africa is still the world's last great frontier market, and today on Inside AB we are talking about how Gulf investors can make the most of the opportunities. I'm Jeremy Lawrence and I'm joined here in the studio by Bernd de Boosman. Okay, Bernd, welcome. Africa is a huge market. We were just talking about this, 54 countries or something like that. Must make sure we talk about the continent now, Africa, because it's a huge place. Traditionally, Gulf investors haven't really got involved as much as they perhaps should do, given our geographical location. Why is that?
Well, like you said, it's really hard to generalize across the board, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but I mean, a lot of them do have a common thread, and then in the past there's been certain issues, for example, corruption, a lack of governance or poor governance, particularly in rural areas. There's also a security factor in a lot of places. I mean, just think about how much we've seen in the last few years, maybe the last decade, in terms of the oil industry in Nigeria has a lot of security issues that they've had to deal with. And there's different security issues in different parts of Africa, but all those things combined have made investors, both from the Gulf and in the West, generally a little reluctant to invest too much in Africa.
Despite the opportunities. And speaking of those, we've had a very interesting op-ed in the magazine this week that talks about some of the newer opportunities that are there. So can you talk about that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think some of the numbers that were in this op-ed were quite startling, and I think perhaps a lot of people aren't familiar with them. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. 4 African countries are among the top 10 improvers in the 2018 Doing Business rankings, which means that a lot of those conditions that we discussed at the beginning are improving, at least in certain parts. And sub-Saharan Africa accounted for the largest number of regulatory reforms, 85 of 264 worldwide. And of course, in the future, because of Africa's demographic, there'll be more opportunities. By 2030, 43% of Africans will belong to the middle or upper classes, up from 39.6 in 2013. So there's a lot of opportunity there in terms of, in the past, I don't think people looked to Africa for consumers, but that's obviously changing.
Incredible numbers there, Bernd. So what sectors are investors looking at more specifically?
Well, it's really across the board. I mean, especially now, especially Chinese investors they've been looking at infrastructure, housing. There's still a need for large-scale infrastructure projects in Africa. They're a little, I'd say, behind the rest of the world in that regard. But also telecommunications, financial services, healthcare, hospitality. I think it's 260 billion is the projected forecast by 2030, and you just look at how many new hotels are opening up in Africa, for example, in Rwanda and Uganda. I think that's a big sector going forward as well. But also in terms of agriculture, 60% of arable land in the world that's still unused is in Africa, and they're not even anywhere near to using up their water resources. So for people in agriculture, that's a huge opportunity as well.
That's incredible. But of course, there are still challenges in Africa. So what did the op-ed talk about in terms of the things that investors need to watch out for?
Well, you kind of touched upon it, was that Africa is 54 countries, and still too many investors seem to think of Africa as this big monolithic block in which everything is the same. So the op-ed called for investors to really do their due diligence in terms of particular markets. For example, Nigeria is not going to be the same market as Kenya. It's not going to be the same market as South Africa or anywhere else. They all have their very specific conditions. And I mean, the way to do that is through a local partner. I mean, people that know how to do things in countries. Of course, there's still quite a bit of bureaucracy that needs to be resolved, and a local partner can help that and kind of figure out the ins and outs of doing business in these countries.
And of course, here in the Gulf and in the UAE, we're perfectly poised to have that entry market into Africa, aren't we? So there's a lot of opportunities.
And I mean, just think of how much of Africa is within 4 or 5 hours flight time of the UAE. It's a lot.
Great. Okay, thanks, Bernd.
Thank you.
All right. The continent of Africa, all 54 countries, rich in promise for Gulf investors if you know what you're doing. So I hope that was helpful to you. Please do comment, subscribe, and share as usual, and we'll see you next time. Bye.